All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I hope you all enjoy the food and the drinks. My name is Jerry Dickinson, Vice Dean at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and I want to thank the Rubash Lecture Committee members for working on planning this wonderful event. I know Dr. Connor and Ron Adoko and Professor St. Val at the School of Law and myself all last semester. I think we started to plan and to look forward to this event. So I want to thank the Rubash Committee for all the work that they have done to get to this event tonight. And just as a brief background, I just want to note sort of the where this Rubash lecture comes from, how long we've had it for. In 1997, Norman and Alice Chapman Rubash created the permanent endowed fund with the University of Pittsburgh for the School of Law and the School of Social Work. And some may say, why those two schools? Well, Alice Chapman Rubash graduated from the School of Social Work in 1956, and Norman Rubash graduated from the School of Law in 57. And so both graduates wanted to have a ongoing dialogue, ongoing program into the future where we brought interdisciplinary scholars to the University of Pittsburgh to have deep-seated conversations on important social and contemporary matters. And so they created the Rubash Distinguished Lecture Series in the law and social work. And ever since then, we've had distinguished professors and practitioners come to the university year in and year out to give us a lecture. So really great background here as a result of the kind gift endowment of the Rubashes. And this year, of course, we have a fantastic distinguished scholar in Professor Lisa Fairfax. But before we get to Professor, I do want to introduce Dr. Carey Connor, who's going to introduce Professor Fairfax for tonight for the keynote lecture. And those who don't know, I'm sure you already know who she is, but Dr. Carey Connor is the Donald Henderson Endowed Chair, Director of the Center on Race and Social Problems, Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Diversity and Inclusion, and Professor. And a lot of her research deals with investigating factors that influence disparities in health and mental health service utilization and treatment outcomes. She's been published numerous times and really is a leader in the field and has received significant number of awards over the years for her work, including Distinguished Alumni of the University of Pittsburgh, Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Civic and Community Engagement, and many other awards. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Connor to the stage to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. I'm so excited to be able to be here with you guys tonight, and as we were sort of just joking about over here, I'm hopeful that there's some social workers and law folks on both sides and that it's not a wedding where we're separated. Really exciting to be able to see this being an in-person event, in the first time in, 5-6 years? So that's incredibly exciting. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. I have had the pleasure of spending the day with Professor Fairfax, and we had an amazing event earlier this afternoon with students from law school, students from the School of Social Work. Also, there were some students, I don't see them here yet, they're probably making their way over here from Juniata College, which is, sort of 3 hours away from here, that came all the way just to be able to have a conversation today with Professor Fairfax. It was a beautiful moment of really seeing students from diverse disciplines who are studying a diverse array of topics really sit down together to have a conversation about real issues that are happening in our society and how we can tackle them from different perspectives. And I really think that's one of the important pieces of what this Rubash lecture is, right? That our social problems are too complex for any one discipline to be able to solve on their own. And social workers and law professionals have a long history of collaboration that we can continue to be able to work together to solve the most critical social problems collectively. Through our synergies, we're able to dismantle barriers, we're able to promote social justice and a more equitable society for all of the communities that we care about. And so I'm really excited to be able to be present and to be able to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, who will continue that strain of conversation around addressing social problems from her unique scholarly lens. So I apologize, I'm gonna have to start reading now because this biography is pretty extensive. But I want to make sure we do it justice because Professor Fairfax certainly deserves a great number of accolades for her work. So Professor Fairfax is the Presidential Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, Carey Law School, and co-director of Penn Law's Institute for Law and Economics. Professor Fairfax's research and scholarly interests include corporate governance, board fiduciary duties, board shareholder engagement, board composition and diversity, board oversight of environmental, social, and governance, shareholder activism, and securities regulation. An award-winning scholar and teacher, Professor Fairfax has devoted a considerable amount of her scholarship on issues at the intersection of corporate governance and social concerns, including corporate obligations to non-shareholder stakeholders, such as employees, customers, and the broader society, board oversight of social matters, board diversity, financial literacy and securities law, and affinity fraud, securities and investment fraud targeted at members of identifiable racial, ethnic, or affinity groups. Professor Fairfax is a public governor of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority and a former member of their National Adjudicatory Council and NASDAQ's Market Regulations Committee. Professor Fairfax served as a member of the Investor Advisory Committee of the Securities and Exchange Commission and is a member of the American Law Institute's advisory group for the restatement of law and corporate governance. Professor Fairfax has previously served on the board of Direct Women, an organization aimed at increasing board diversity, and prior to joining the Penn Law School faculty, she was the Alexander Hamilton Professor of Business Law at the George Washington University Law School and founder and director of their Corporate Law and Governance Initiative. And prior to joining GW, she was Professor of Law and Director of the Business Law program at the University of Maryland School of Law. Before entering academia, she practiced corporate and securities law with the law firm of Ropes and Gray, LLP. Professor Fairfax also graduated from Harvard Law School and Harvard College with honors. It is my pleasure to introduce to the stage Professor Lisa Fairfax.
Thank you so much. That was long. It is my great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Connor, for doing such outstanding work with regard to this center and such outstanding work with regard to making sure I got here. On time, and it was really your compelling presence and nature that made me want to come here to honor you and the work that is happening here in Pittsburgh. I will say three things. The first is my husband was born in Pittsburgh at McGee Women's Hospital, a lifelong Steelers fan, because that's all you can be when you're born in Pittsburgh. His mother got her bachelor's and her pharmacy degree from Pittsburgh, which was why they were here in Pittsburgh for my husband to be born. So the Pittsburgh connection is quite strong. The other thing I love about this center is that combination of social science and the law. And absolutely right, that moves social problems. It is that combination, of course, that served as the foundation for Brown and the legal and social work that went together hand in hand to bring us the most groundbreaking case around race and social justice. I have to just humble brag. My daughter used to be a PhD candidate. Today, she defended her proposal and became a doctoral candidate. And what's especially outstanding about that happening today, as I speak to you, is that my daughter her PhD is in sociology, but it is at the intersection of sociology, data science, and her work is around racial equity with regard to healthcare. So too many things coming together to imagine. Some people may be confused as they think about the title of this talk. What does corporate governance have to do with addressing social problems? And my answer is everything. I was a corporate transactional lawyer, and we like to be transparent. So I'm going to be transparent with you and tell you my bottom line. And my bottom line is twofold. The first, that corporations can and must play a role in addressing important social problems, which means that those who suggest otherwise are actually undermining the ability for us to bring all of the tools to bear on important social issues. The second is the important role that corporate governance must play with respect to the corporation addressing social problems. What do I mean by corporate governance? Corporate governance refers to those internal policies and practices that corporations utilize to govern. And sometimes we don't really think about that when we think about the work that corporations do. But my scholarship is around what do corporations need to do in order to govern effectively, especially when we want them to govern with an eye towards addressing social problems. So in my talk today, I'll do three things. The first is I want to discuss, why there's even a debate about corporations' role in addressing social problems. And then I'll respond to that debate and talk about why I'm right. I like to be right. And then finally, I'll talk about corporate governance in particular and what I mean by focusing on corporate governance, and I'll give you some examples about why we must pay attention to corporate governance if we want corporations to effectively play a role in addressing social problems. And I will then, of course, offer a brief conclusion. So first, who are the naysayers? What are they saying? I'll highlight 5 things that I think the naysayers say around the corporation's role in addressing social problems. The first is it's illegal, right? Corporations have a for-profit purpose and a fiduciary duty, right, to that purpose, and so focusing on something else, that's illegal. The second is it's illegitimate. Because when the corporation focuses on social problems, that means it's focusing on something that's not aligned with legitimate business activity. The third is it's actually infeasible, right? This is what sometimes people refer to as the two masters problem, right? We can't have people serving two masters, right? Money, and that's a big master, and social problems. That's not going to work, right? No one will be able to do that effectively. The fourth is that it's actually unrealistic to think that corporations that are this big profit-making machine will somehow be able to turn their attention to social problems in a way that will prove effective. And the final is it's inappropriate, right? We have an app for that in terms of social problems. That app is regulators, right? And when we have corporations try to step into the lanes of regulators, that's inappropriate, and so we need to stop. So what's my response to each of these arguments? I would say that first concern around illegality, that's like the dagger, right? It is illegal, they say, for for-profit companies to do this. And in fact, when critics use that illegality, they back that claim up by bringing lawsuits, right, saying that it's a breach of director and officer's fiduciary duty. They actually passed legislation, 200 strong, talking about they need to get back in their lane. Don't talk about equity or justice or environmental matters, right? You need to focus on pecuniary issues because that's your lane, right? And doing something outside of that lane is illegal. On the one hand, I want to be clear, this idea that it's illegal can find some traction, right? There's a very famous New York Times headline from Milton Friedman. I speak to my law people now when I say that. The headline is, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits," right? Repudiation of this idea, right, that businesses should even try to be socially responsible. But even more important than that, there are several iconic cases that seem to suggest that corporations must focus on profit, and that is it. Dodge v. Ford Motor Company, again, looking to my law people, that's the big one. A business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of the stockholders. The power of directors are to be employed to that end. That is the quote heard around the world in all corporate classes. All right? And then there's a case about Revlon that talks about, in the context of a takeover, when the breakup and sale is inevitable, you must maximize profits. In 2010, there was a case called eBay. And eBay said that it is inappropriate for a corporation to engage in activity that, quote, specifically, clearly, and admittedly seeks not to maximize the economic value of for-profit Delaware corporations for the benefit of its stockholders. That's pretty heavy weight there, right? So now you're thinking, uh-oh. But I know my stuff. And appearances can be deceiving. A closer look at fiduciary law suggests that if that's the way you're teaching corporate law, you're not teaching it the right way. While Dodge is often hailed as the exemplar of a corporation's inability to focus on social issues, the court in Dodge refused to prevent the board from carrying out its plan to expand the business. Even though the court acknowledged that there was, quote unquote, no doubt that humanitarian sentiments had a large influence in determining the policy being pursued by the company. Yet the court did not stop them from pursuing that policy. eBay even acknowledges that there is significant deference that's given to boards when they are operating, right, in the business sphere. That deference means, quote, when director decisions are reviewed under what we call the business judgment rule, this court will not question rational judgments about how promoting non-stakeholder interests, be it through making charitable contributions, paying employees higher salaries and benefits, or more general norms like promoting a particular corporate culture, ultimately promote stockholder value. And even when we talk about Revlon is about a flash in time. Most companies actually never are subjected to a takeover, right? The rest of the time, outside of what we call the Revlon zone, the Delaware Supreme Court has been clear. That is, carrying out their fiduciary duties, directors can consider the impact of other constituents, and then they list them: creditors, customers, employees, even the community generally. So when shareholders bring suit, trying to say that it's a breach of fiduciary duty to focus on things beyond shareholder profit, those suits are losers. And in fact, empirical evidence suggests that shareholders have not been successful historically bringing those suits, and modern courts have agreed. In a case designed to challenge Starbucks' focus on DEI policies, naming it as illegal and inconsistent with fiduciary duty, all right, the court was like, I'm sorry, maybe you don't understand the law. No, those are my words. Instead, the court said the plaintiffs have ignored the fundamental rules of corporate law, including the business judgment rule. Courts of law have no business involving themselves with legitimate and legal decisions made by the board of directors of public corporations. The decision was not surprising. Like I said, it is not illegal to focus on, for corporations to focus on social issues, and that is clearly the law. So then we get to this illegitimacy concern, right? Okay, maybe it's not illegal, but right, illegitimate, because you're supposed to be pursuing business activities, and particularly because remember, eBay was like, and you can't intentionally be trying to impact social things, right? That's crazy. Who would do that? That's not legitimate. Let me correct the record for you on that as well. Corporate fiduciary law makes clear that there are a range of social issues that businesses can legitimately pursue, right? And in fact, don't try to play the name game, because courts have been clear. Labeling something social doesn't make it inconsistent with business activity. Whether or not it's inconsistent or consistent with business activity, number one, is a question we allow corporations to respond to. They get to judge. So it doesn't matter that you don't think it is. Nobody cares, right? But more importantly, there are many reasons why doing things focus not just on grappling with social issues, but impacting social issues could be consistent with legitimate business activity. I bring you Dodge yet again. People need to read it much more closely, right? What was Dodge about? Actually, first, we should note that Dodge emphasized that there are a range of issues related to workers that are clearly legitimate business activities that fall under the discretion of the board of directors, including, quote, the wages which shall be paid to employees, the number of hours they shall work, the conditions under which labor shall be carried on. Why did the court make that clear? If they were all like, oh, you can't do it, right? It's because, oh my goodness, in that case, Henry Ford had decided that he wanted to pursue a business plan that at the time seemed crazy. People were calling him crazy, radical. What you're doing is inconsistent with profit making and good business behavior. What was he doing? What he was doing was changing the workday from 6 days a week to 5 days, reducing the hours that workers worked from 60 hours to 40 hours, increasing their wages, improving their working conditions, and reducing the price of the Ford Model T. He had lost his mind, they said. That is illegitimate. And he said, I think what that's going to do is increase worker morale. It's going to allow people to go home and have a real weekend and come back refreshed. It's going to increase worker loyalty. That's what he said. And even workers were like, he's crazy, but I'll take the day off. Right? Turns out he was not crazy. He was right, and his profit soared. Most importantly, in business, it's not about being right or wrong. We're making a guess, right, about what may be possible, and sometimes we are wrong. What the business judgment rule allows for is that you to use your business judgment to do what you think matters. So that is where the law stands. And I would add all of this hand-wringing about, oh no, corporations can't be involved in supporting social messages. That's crazy. And yet there's this long-standing recognition by the Supreme Court that corporations absolutely can be involved in that. I'm sorry, that's called commercial speech. And it's been protected historically, right? Because we believe that commercial speech, even if it's bound up in social messaging, allows you to gain a competitive advantage. It's a legitimate business activity, in other words. So, yes, you can create a T-shirt with a Confederate flag on it. And you can also create a T-shirt that says Black Lives Matter. Turns out both of those things are true. It's also true that we've condoned charitable giving, right, as a legitimate business activity. And so all of this, oh no, don't do it, right? And charitable giving is an especially important case because that's just about giving money and we think it's going to have an impact. And what has the court said about that? That's a legitimate business activity. Because actually when you do things that have an impact, sometimes they inure to your benefit, even if it's just people get warm and fuzzies about you. It could be that tenuous. And I will say that the case about charitable giving is especially instructive because the landmark case with regard to charitable giving and approving corporations' right to engage in charitable giving is a case involving Princeton. I don't want to bring up another P university as we're here, but it's a 1953 case. And it's the subject of a seminal case because the first case to sanction corporations' right to donate to a charitable institution. I bring that case up not simply because it upheld charitable donations to an educational institution, but because it upheld those donations at a time where Princeton had an acknowledged history of racial exclusion, segregation, and discrimination, including during the time frame of that donation. Princeton not only had excluded black undergraduates all the way up into the mid-20th century, but also had revoked the admission of the very first black person admitted to Princeton, right? When he showed up, they were like, ooh, uh-oh, we've made a mistake. We didn't realize you were black. You're going to have to leave, boo. And that's what happened. He left. Yes, that is what happened. And that is the donation that was upheld in the landmark case, upholding corporations' ability to make, basically, I think, social statements, right, to impact social institutions, educational institutions. So you can't change history when we're trying to do that for historically black institutions. That's not the way it works. Right? Long history of calling that a business activity. And I don't even, I think, have to go into the long history of sanctions around political contributions. It may be controversial, but there's a history. And we're not just talking about political donations, which were freed up just recently. I'm talking about political lobbying, which is a time-honored legitimate business endeavor. And just to be clear, we all know that with regard to political lobbying, corporations have been on the front lines of intrusion with regard to that lobbying. There's reasons why some of the most important and impactful legislation around social and racial issues took so long, right? Because corporations were involved with making them take so long. And we call that a legitimate business opportunity. So now, when corporations are in fact trying to be on the other side of the lever, we can't change history and call it something else. What it is legitimate business activity. And importantly, from my point of view, it means so long as they're in that activity, we have to be realistic about who we need to work with if we want to address that activity and make real change. The impracticality argument is about the serving two masters. I talked about that. How are we going to make trade-offs? What to do, right? I view that, on the one hand, yes, I'm not fine, right? People have different interests, right? And that's true whether or not we're talking about economic interests or whether or not we're talking about issues that align with social and racial justice. But don't get it twisted. Shareholders have different interests. And if all you were told to do was maximize the interests of shareholders, you would still have to do the what to do, and make the trade-offs, right? More importantly, I already told you, businesses have been in the business of engaging around social issues since business began. That means this is what they do, make trade-offs, right? We need to be involved in the decision about how those trade-offs are made, not burying our head in the sand and pretending that they are not happening. More importantly, actually, businesses have experience doing this. They're not doing the what to do. On the ground, this is what businesses do, again, every day. And as a practical matter, we have to get involved. The fourth thing that people say is it's unrealistic, and that's really because there's this feeling that once you put a profit motive, once you put money on the table, right, social issues, right, cannot stand a chance. And I appreciate that sentiment. And to some extent, one of the reasons why we're getting a lot of greenwashing, if you heard of that term, this idea that companies are making statements about doing the right thing and then they get caught out there like, ooh, but they donated to the guy who's not doing the right thing. How does that work, right? One of the reasons why we're getting so much of that is because when money's on the table, it's hard to make real commitment. And more importantly, when no one can tell the difference between real and illusory commitment, it's easy to engage in signaling without doing the real work. So that is a real concern. But I don't think it's a fatal concern. I think in many ways, some of the hypocrisy is not even intentional. Companies are siloed. Right? The CEO saying one thing, the marketing department doing something else, right? I don't even know what's going on. Secondly, companies actually are wrestling with difficult issues. Why do we know? Because this is a difficult issue. Sometimes they actually don't know that the behaviors they're engaging in would be deemed inconsistent with some of the commitments they're making. Until we tell them, we do have to point it out, right? That's okay. So that is something to keep in mind. But perhaps more importantly than that, there is, in fact, evidence that companies are trying to do something. Not all companies, not all the time, not in every way, right? But companies are making commitments. The level of disclosure around social and environmental issues has gone up dramatically. The vast majority of companies are disclosing. But they're going beyond disclosing. They're making commitments. They're setting goals. Those goals now are kind of time-bound. We're going to try to achieve it next year or in 2 years. They're tying compensation decisions to social environmental concerns. And so they are doing some work. Maybe it's not enough. And that's where we come in. That's where corporate governance comes in. But things are happening. It is not impossible. The last thing is, of course, the regulators. Why don't we just leave it to them? I feel like are you not watching the world? One of the reasons why there's so much push to get corporations to move the needle in these issues is because of regulatory failure, right? One of the reasons why we have to look to other agencies and entities is because regulatory capture, right? They're not getting the job done. Their efforts to address important social problems have been stalled, delayed, and when they do materialize, so watered down that it doesn't even, what is that trying to do? Right? And then sometimes so outdated by the time they actually get implemented, right, that regulation can't solve it all. I do think regulation sometimes is so important to serve as a baseline, to kind of be a collection of best practices. But I love to have my cake and eat it too. And you cannot stop there. Why not? First, the reason you can't stop there is because corporations actually disrupt legislation. We have to acknowledge that. Let's please acknowledge that. What is the reason why we haven't gotten a climate disclosure bill? That's corporations. Right? Why don't we have a policing bill? What's happening with voter rights and voter suppression? Where's that coming from? Where's that disruption? I'm going to tell you where, because we now can trace some of the dollars. Right? So understand that's some of the reason why we're not getting the regulation that we want. You may say that proves the point, doesn't it? Corporations, they're dirty. But we can shine a light on that, right? Especially if we're thinking about appropriate corporate governance, and especially after they've made these commitments, right? When you catch them out there after they've made the commitments, doing the stuff, it's crazy. But oftentimes what happens is they either fess up, you're right, or they try to change. So there is important movement even there, and we need to make sure corporations are at the table because corporations are at the table, right? Perhaps more importantly than any of that is just the reality, right? Regulators pass laws. Corporations and institutions implement those laws, right? Whether or not you're talking about work and safety or environmental, that's the corporation's job. They put into place the governance policies, practices, and protocols to make sure that there's compliance. Compliance occurs within the interior of their company. They put in place, or not, incentives for making sure that that compliance happens. They put in place the monitoring and detection devices associated, right? And if they do it well, we don't even know their name. If they do it poorly, yeah, Boeing, McDonald's, I could go on, right? And that's just, doesn't matter how great the law is if it turns out the corporation isn't involved in helping you effectively implement that law. And the last thing I'll say just about this regulators are better is, okay, fine, but corporations got a lot of money. Oftentimes because we've let them have a lot of money. Tax breaks, tax shields, they're doing the thing in the thing, right? That people say, when that happens, what does that mean? Lots of responsibility. But they got a lot of resources, and we need to unleash some of those resources in favor of addressing social problems, some of them that they've created or tried to disrupt. That's okay. That seems just, right? So when corporations say they're trying to do it, they're getting ready to do it, all right, let's go. All right, yes, we need their resources. Right? Some of the resources that we need is just money. Yes. Other resources that we need is actually their intellect and experience. Actually, I believe, I know, I'm a corporate securities lawyer. The corporate and securities lawyers, business people, are some of the smartest people in the world. Do you not want their intellect at the table when you're trying to grapple with these problems? We have to come together to think about how it works. These problems appear to be intractable. So you shouldn't leave any stone unturned, leaving people outside the door, especially when they're supposed to be the ones implementing, right? You need to figure out what they need in order to make sure that implementation works. So we should not leave corporations out of the equation in terms of addressing social and racial problems. And how can we help? What does corporate governance have to do with it? I told you, governance is about the systems that are in place to ensure that the corporation can kind of move in the right direction. I'll talk about 4 key areas of corporate governance. You knew I would get there. Board diversity. Board diversity matters, absolutely. And that's not me. 99% of corporations express a belief that board diversity is necessary for good corporate governance, right? Board diversity leads to a consideration of a broader range of perspectives and outcomes, which improves your ability to assess risk. It leads to a broader consideration of benefits and how to more effectively take advantage of those benefits. It's not enough to know that you need to reach out to certain populations. It's not even enough to know that they have some economic potential. You got to know how to get it done. You got to know who to talk to, how to talk to them, how to bring them into the circle. That's diversity. Board diversity changes the conversation in the room, and it has ripple effects for these really important social considerations. And empirical and anecdotal evidence proves that, right? That evidence shows that diverse boards are more likely to support diverse leadership beyond the boardroom. Diverse leadership is also, of course, important for thinking about inclusion and perspective. They're more likely to consider and recognize the importance of key social issues, right? Lots of studies say if you get women in the boardroom, they're likely to think more about workplace issues, think more about worker safety, actually think more about financial risk and the protocols associated for minimizing that risk. More likely to take concrete steps, not just thinking. Everybody likes to think. We're not trying to just think around here, right? To take concrete steps to address these problems, right? A study focused on federal regional banks showed that more diverse bank boards are more likely to invest in underserved and predominantly minority communities, more likely to take important action, more likely to follow up and assess what's working and what is not, right? They don't program and look away because it matters to them. And they want to know, is it working? We're not just trying to do some paper thing. How we doing for real? And I will just mention that in terms of corporate governance and thinking about the importance of diversity, right, this is what the fight at Disney is all about, if you haven't been paying attention, right? Disney's board is under fire, right? There's a power struggle. The power struggle is about race. Why do I say that? It's because there are some people on Disney's board and in Disney's leadership that believe in inclusion. And it's not just black people. There are people there, black, white, purple, because it's Disney, that believe in inclusion, believe in it so much that they made it a reality. And so they are the people that brought you Black Panther. They are the people that brought you Captain Marvel. Yes, that's the all-women's version, right? They are the people that are saying we need to have faces that look like the rest of the world. But on the other side are those people that's like, oh, that's woke, right? To be clear, woke is a term that's actually positive. So I'm saying that's the way they use it. I agree it's woke, and let's keep going. Wake up, people, wake up, right? But they also say, oh, you know, that's going to, right, undermine profits, right? Undermine, right? And then what they really say is we want to return to the Disney of old. Disney of old, you know, the all-white cast with subtle and not so subtle racial messaging that we, right, pimped out on everyone for years and years. Okay, fine. Diversity matters, right? And it's not just, again, it was not just the people of color in leadership and on the board. There were other people who understood that diversity matters, and it matters to the economic bottom line. Did you see the returns on Black Panther? And I want to say this about board diversity. Lots of people, I said 99% of corporations say that diversity matters. Some of them try to do the Jedi mind trick, though. And they say, yeah, it matters, but you can actually get there without race or gender. We actually think what you need is diversity of experience and thought and perspective, right? And other demographics. So while 99% of corporations say that diversity matters, 90% of directors believe you can get there without race or gender. I'm here to tell you that social science and empirical research does not support that claim, right? Boards with greater racial and gender diversity bring greater age diversity. So if you're trying to do something else, boards with greater racial and gender diversity bring a greater diversity of background and experience. All white boards essentially are all CEOs, right? And a CEO is important to have on a board, but you don't need to stack the deck. Boards that lack diversity with respect to race and gender are also likely to lack diversity with respect to perspective and thought. Social science research, I'm telling you, you guys tell me if I'm wrong, not now, of course, right? But social science suggests, right, that race and gender are key determinants of a person's experience, attitudes, frame of reference, and point of view, right? And directors, when you really ask them, they tell you the truth, right? 93% of them believe that race and gender is linked to perspective. right? 80+% of them believe that race and gender is linked to diversity of thought, right? And the data around this is unequivocal. You put women on the board, they're more likely to believe and focus on certain issues, right? And it doesn't matter about their social economic similarities with the other men on the board, right? Race and gender matters. It matters for diversity. It matters for diversity of thought and experience. It matters for corporate governance. I said I was going to do 4 things, so I'm going to talk about the rest in a shorter time frame. But the second thing I do want to make sure everyone appreciates is shareholder power. All right. One of the biggest phenomena in corporate governance has been the rise in shareholder power. And lots of people disagree about, is it good or bad? I want to say it's good or bad. It is. Shareholders have significant power, and they are using that power to impact corporate governance. Good news, there are many institutional shareholders who have said, we are concerned about environmental and social issues. We believe you need to address them. That's why it's actually no surprise that companies are starting to say, we've got to focus on these things, because shareholders have said, we care about these things. And shareholders are using their tools and resources to pressure boards to focus on these issues. But not all shareholders are created equal, and there are other shareholders that are pushing back, right? Trying to encourage boards to dismantle their racial equity audit commitments, to dismantle their environmental, right? This is happening to be shareholders upon shareholders, right? And so we do have to focus on that from a corporate governance perspective, right? It's not just do shareholders have power, but which shareholders? And what are the mechanisms we can use to try to think through which ones are operating and have power, and how does that relate to the corporation's ability to focus on social issues? Third thing, I mentioned briefly, compensation. Money matters. The reason why compensation is such a big corporate governance issue is because there's this feeling, there's this feeling, right, that the things you tie executive compensation to will matter, right? It will have an impact on what not only the executive, but the entire enterprise focuses on. So yes, there's been this push to get companies to actually tie their compensation to social goals. And that is happening. 73% of S&P 500 companies. But the devil is in the details, right? Is it working? How's it going to work, right? Are these fake goals or real goals? But that's important, getting to that compensation piece, right? Compensation is also important because we know we have racial wealth gaps and inequities in compensation. Good news on that front, from a governance perspective, compensation committees are now trying to address broader workforce issues. That's been a trend. How they're addressing it, what are they doing with it, we don't know yet, but it's happening, and we have to be in the rooms where it happens to think about what that conversation looks like, and certainly you need diversity in those conversations, or we're not sure which way it will go. Finally is board oversight. Board oversight is a significant governance function. What it means is that board has oversight of material issues within the company. What it means is that boards have to create information systems that give them information about what's happening, because of course they don't know. So they have to put the systems in place to try to figure it out. They have to address concerns when they arise. And the good news is 97% of S&P 500 companies have some form of board oversight of environmental and social issues. That's a good start. That's a great start, right? And now we have to figure out how to make that oversight effective. What are the systems that need to be put in place, the policies, the practices, and how do we move beyond paper to actually effective systems? It's a hard question, right? But again, when it isn't done correctly, it makes the news, right? And I give you again McDonald's. They had a system, if that's what you want to call it. A system without multiple ways to communicate out problems. A system where it didn't seem like there was that much training in how to recognize harassment. A system pursuant to which, right, people were allowed to ignore complaints. A system where McDonald's had a zero tolerance, zero, that means none, zero, for sexual harassment, and waived it for their chief people's officer, the guy in charge of making sure that sexual harassment did not take place at their company. Yikes is right. That's corporate governance, right? No law is going to reach in and be able to appropriately steer that kind of governance. You need an internal system and monitoring, because when the board was sued, the court said this is a matter of business judgment. And that means we got to get in there and make sure that businesses are making judgments that more appropriately focus on social issues. That is the corporate governance challenge, but I also believe that is the corporate governance promise. Corporations have tremendous social impact. They employ large numbers of people. The products they create impact water supplies, greenhouse gas emissions, and many more. They operate in supply chains through which they have a window into human rights, child labor, slavery, and other violations. They engage in the political process, helping or thwarting laws, depending on which side they're on. It would be foolish of us not to partner with those corporations to try to tackle social problems, to try to right the ship. The corporation is made up of people. People can be changed. People commit crimes, it is true, not entities. But people also do the right thing every day. And that, I think, is also the problem of the corporation and how we can think about its role in social problems. Thank you so much for listening, and of course for having me here.
That was so amazing. I'm sure that we have questions from the audience, and we have a mic that's going around. So if you just raise your hand.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank
Good
you for the
afternoon.
presentation. I thought it was excellent.
Thank you.
I was in the U.S. Department of Justice, the Environment Division, when the United States Sentencing Guidelines went into effect in 1991, and I prosecuted corporations. So what we did is we gave a benefit to any company that had an effective corporate compliance program. If the company didn't, then any company that had more than 50 employees had to go on organizational probation, and the court had to impose a corporate compliance program to kind of affect the material risks. And I was involved in one case in Miami where the company didn't have a corporate compliance program. So the judge looked at me and he said, "Government, I want you to create one for this company." It was a cruise ship company. We did that, and the company eventually went bankrupt. So it was kind of a good lesson that every company needs to have an effective corporate compliance program, has to meet the 7 minimum criteria in the U.S. sentencing guidelines. And so I advocate, now I'm in private practice, and I'm also on the adjunct faculty here at the law school. And what I advocate to companies is to kind of follow Professor Michael Vandenberg at Vanderbilt, his theory on private governance. Because, as you know, probably better than I do, the SEC just came out with a rule on climate disclosure. There's a lot of scholars that think that's not going to survive, that under the major questions doctrine, that's beyond the authority of the SEC. So I think really good advice to companies is don't kind of rely on what government tells you to do. Have good, effective private corporate governance, because in a year from now, the administration can change. The composition of Congress can change. And whatever that regulation is today may not be the regulation. But what do you want? You want a good, effective, sustainable company. And I think that's what shareholders want, right? Is the company going to be here in 5 years? If you don't have a good climate disclosure program or environmental or social, like with ESG, then that company's probably not sustainable. But my question to you is, what do you think the U.S. Supreme Court is going to do with the major questions doctrine when this issue gets to it? Because it will, just like EPA versus West Virginia, the court's going to say, does the SEC have this authority to issue this regulation, or doesn't it? And if it doesn't, then, of course, it will be stricken. But what is your view? Do you think it's going to survive?
So I will say there is considerable disagreement about the climate rule, right? Is it good or bad? There's differing opinions about what the court will do. Everyone knew, though, the one opinion everyone shared is it will be challenged, right? So we knew that the rule was going to come and it would be challenged. It's not clear what's going to, I won't make a prediction there. But I do know that because it will be challenged, there will be delays. And this is why, as corporations, they got to step up. We can't wait for that, especially because corporations operate in the global economy. And the rest of the world has already figured out that you need to figure out climate. You need to understand the risk and opportunities with respect to climate, or you will not be sustainable. It's so, to me, surprising that you get people in Florida and Texas with their weather storms and hurricanes and record heat, who want to say, right, there's no economic connection between climate. What are you talking about? Right? Did you not just have to shut down for how many days? Did you not just have to disrupt? This is crazy talk. But I think most companies appreciate that it is crazy and that they have to understand and have, yes, a great compliance system in place that assesses that risk and figures out how to mitigate it. And I will just say one thing. I know I said more than one thing, but the corporate fiduciary law around oversight and around systems is based on the sentencing guidelines. That's what they took their inspiration from. So you're absolutely right that there is this feeling that systems are important. Internal corporate systems are important, and it carries over from the regulators into corporate law. The one thing we should be cautious about is systems operate in a culture that operate in an industry. And if the industry incentivizes certain things, you can have the best system in the world. And even the company could have the best incentives in the world. But when they're operating in this competitive industry that's leaning in the other direction, it gets a lot more complicated, which is, again, why we need to wrap our arms around as many companies as we can to think about the industry standard, the industry best practices, to get everybody moving in the right direction, because actually it is problematic to have this mismatch, because that could leave us without full coverage, I'll say.
Hi, thank you for what you shared this evening. My name is Abby Bonilla, and I'm a dual MSW MBA student. And as someone who's coming from many years on the ground in nonprofit spaces and looking to push into for-profit, potentially government spaces, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about board involvement. And in nonprofit spaces, sometimes there tends to be inactive boards. And I'm curious to know more about what that looks like on the for-profit side and making sure that a board is active and involved with the corporation and the business and the activities.
Yeah. Well, the easy answer is, the law around board fiduciary duties has really tightened up. And while it may be true that boards, the potential for legal liability at the end of the day is very low, they get sued all the time. And they're told by their lawyers that they have a fiduciary obligation to be engaged, right, to oversee, to listen to minutes and, et cetera. So I think what you see on the corporate director side, some people may say it's going through the motions, but they are much more engaged than they ever were before, much more active than they ever were before. A lot of it is because some of this stuff is new, but also because there is the specter of liability. And every time you get a case, even if all it does is pass a motion to dismiss, right, the Delaware courts send a roadmap about here's what we are expecting directors to do.
My name is Thomas. I'm a 1L here
Hi.
at Pitt. Thank you so much for coming. This was really an interesting lecture. I'm wondering, I think you're bring up the Henry Ford example of the sort of culture then and what going against the grain meant and what was viewed as good business practices versus where we are now. I think Boeing, GE are fantastic examples of leaning to the point of cannibalizing your own company and sacrificing future profitability for like quarterly gains. So I'm wondering how you see corporate social governance sort of dovetailing with what is just good corporate governance and if we're going to maybe see the pendulum swing back the other way.
Yeah, and I guess my answer to that would be I think the hope is that we wouldn't view those two things as distinct, right? Good governance means focusing on these social issues and effectively grappling with them and trying to address them. And at the very least, you need to understand the risk and opportunities associated with these social issues if you're going to govern effectively. And I think some companies are trying to get there, and they're being pushed by shareholders to get there, and that's my hope about what it looks like.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I'm a visiting professor here at Pitt Law, and I've been working on U.S. corporate ESG and also climate change litigation. I had the feeling that companies, due to the pressure from insurance, but also from their own internal risk management, are putting climate and climate change litigation as an additional element of potential risk for the company. So since more and more cases are appearing, not only from no-profit or communities against states or against abroad, or not only in the US, or against companies, more and more. So did you, based on your quality studies that you did you perceive that this is happening? Did you perceive that the company, the board, and the internal corporate governance is changing indeed to acknowledge, even though maybe they don't yet think they have to do something to solve the problem of climate change, but they consider it as a liability, and so they have to do something to prevent this liability? So do you have data or analysis that can corroborate these assumptions?
Yeah, I think that's a trend that's starting to happen. I've seen it kind of in surveys and rather than comprehensive data. And by that, I mean companies starting to focus on thinking about climate as a risk because of that deluge of regulation and the pushback around companies that are focused on it and the potential for litigation, and importantly, the potential for litigation from both sides. So thinking about how you manage that risk is really important. I think good board governance and good directors understand that conversation has to pivot to think about what are the opportunities, right, with regard to climate. How can we position ourselves in a way to take advantage of those opportunities? Because I will say it's also starting to happen with diversity, that you're starting to hear people talk about companies, directors talk about diversity as a risk and a liability. And while we do want you to appreciate, you need to have a clear-eyed understanding that they're a risk. You need to understand what's on the other side of that and think through the opportunities and why it doesn't make sense for you to shut down, right, given the significance of those opportunities.
Thank you.
When it comes to a corporate board setting its social agenda, which stakeholders do you think are the most influential, and which should be the most influential? And is it appropriate for the board itself to, like, sui generis set its own agenda, its own social agenda?
That's interesting. Well, I will. The answer from a legal perspective, right, is yes, right? We defer to the board, and we've always deferred to the board about whether and to what extent they're going to engage around these really important social issues. And I don't think that's going to change any time soon. I think in terms of stakeholder influence, it's clear that shareholders have significant influence. Like, that is the reality. But that's also why it matters that you have so many institutional shareholders kind of try to get corporations to focus on social issues. But I think the other stakeholders now that are really gaining a lot of traction, I mean, they've always been there. Wait, what's the other important stakeholder group? Workers. right? Part of the Disney story is they tried to be like, we're not going to take a stand, we're not going to say nothing, we're not going to do nothing. Their workers were revolting. Their workers, their suppliers, their partners, because they had made promises to them about their commitment to diversity. And I think the fact that Disney was, at some level, forced to come out against what was happening in Florida is a testament not to its shareholders, but to its workers. And you're starting to see workers and the impact that they're having on the board. And I think it's less about setting agenda, but from a governance standpoint, in my view, is about what voices do you need to hear in order to make sure, right, that you're engaging in the right way, and that you are taking into account all of the various stakeholders that are in your company domain.
Hi, Daniel, 3L. Building off that question, you mentioned Dodge v. Ford. You know, you can consider all the different stakeholders, but shareholders have the vote, right, of the board of directors. Creditors have the seniority in bankruptcy. How do, besides revolting, or potentially an economic decision that the board makes about keeping the local constituency, the community that they're keeping them happy or keeping the workers happy, is there thinking around having a vote for the stakeholders beyond just equity holders in these big decisions? Does that work, or is it always going to be, whatever the shareholders vote on? Because that seems to always be the specter over you. It's like, sure, you can consider them, but in the end of the day, someone who has 51% can vote you out.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that's a feature of the corporate enterprise, right? The shareholders not only have the vote power, but they have the litigation power. And that's the way. And I guess on the one hand, I think lots of people have tried to think through solutions where we give others levers of power, and they've never stuck. So I try to be a realist. I do think that employees can exercise power. Like I mentioned, the Disney case, it is true that it's usually it has to be in a concentrated form or in some dramatic in some dramatic way. But I will not deny that there is a huge tilt towards shareholders, and if you don't have a shareholder base that's concerned about these long-term issues, then you're going to have a real uphill climb.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for your talk. I think it's a very important topic. So because I'm from a different country, China, and I know, like, for example, Germany, they put the workers on the board, and so that's part of diversity. And I read your paper about ESG disclosure, and that's another perspective for this topic as well. But for me, I came to U.S. and studied the Delaware corporate law. I started to think about it, and my angle is from fiduciary duty. But I realized that in recent years, for example, like there are a lot of people talk about fiduciary duty is going to die, and the corporate law, Delaware corporate law, is going to die. So, and also the ESG topic is so popular in recent years. But I keep asking myself, I don't have an answer. So I'm curious your thoughts about it. Like, what the Delaware law can do, or will they involved in these issues, or can they push, or how can we push them to push the corporation to do something real good for the society? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. For those who, in the corporate field, Delaware, why we talk about Delaware so much? Because that is corporate law, right? The vast majority of S&P 500 companies are incorporated in Delaware, right? Delaware fiduciary law is governed by your state of incorporation, right? So that is why Delaware law is so important. And even for companies that are not incorporated in Delaware, most of those states look to Delaware law. Now, there's been this recent movement where people are trying to say, we're going to leave Delaware, we can go somewhere else, right? We take our balls and go home. And, it's not clear if that movement, Delaware has such a primacy and such a dominance in this area that it's hard to imagine. But Delaware, and so some people feel like that means Delaware can't be moved. But Delaware also lives in the universe, right? Some people feel like the reason why we got Tesla, if you're not Penn, Tesla basically, it's a Delaware opinion that, said, Elon Musk, you're getting paid too much, we're taking it away. And people feel like the reason that happened was Delaware's acknowledgement and recognition that, people don't think this is okay. And if you continue to issue opinions where people are like, that's crazy, right? Somebody else will step in, and it's not other states, it's the federal government. They're going to do something about this. So I do think that hangs over the head of Delaware. And I also think, right, that there's a spate of oversight cases that tell you about where Delaware is trying to go. They're not what everybody wanted, but they are a movement. And what I mean by that is there are these cases in Delaware, when I mentioned McDonald's, these cases essentially say McDonald's doesn't have a good information system, or they didn't pay enough attention to red flags. And in fact, officers are the problem. And we're going to think about holding them responsible. In Boeing, yes, it involved death. And the same thing with Marchand, which is the ice cream factory that involved death. But there, the court was saying you need better systems in place. You need better monitoring. It's not okay. And the one thing they kept saying over and over again, it is not okay to prioritize profit over these other issues. That's Delaware. It is not okay. So I do think Delaware's moving. I mean, that's why people are all, right, oh my God, Delaware has lost its mind. But Delaware is reading the tea leaves and understanding that people are concerned about these issues, and these issues have repercussions, and these boards have to do their jobs in ways that mitigate those repercussions. I keep looking at my phone because I got a plane to catch, but I want to hear your question. Yes, I'm sorry.
A question. I went to the business school at this prestigious institution back in the 70s, and the book we had was The Role of Corporate Responsibility. And at that time, the issue was who runs the corporation, and they had put it all under technocrats to solve these kinds of issues, not the board. And I was so glad to hear you saying that they finally got to the board. I don't know how many years ago they got to the board to make them the head of these things, but they had said the technocrats are the ones responsible for bringing the social issues, and I guess they abandoned that responsibility and said, we're technocrats, we're not going to do the social responsibility in toto. You have to do some yourself. So I was glad to see that.
Yeah, and can I say, at some level, this current focus on social issues is not new. There's historically, most people feel like there's only one camp in corporate law. That's the camp that, like, we just want money all day, every day. But many people who are in that space believe that you have to focus on these issues. And most of us believe you need to focus on these issues because actually they lead to long-term health and sustainability if you're focusing on them correctly. I will say, most people characterize corporate social responsibility as like you should just do it because it's the right thing. And that usually leads to pay some money to charity, like do some, right, support some historically black colleges, and then you're good. The difference today with regard to ESG and even these oversight is that companies are starting to say, no, these are issues that go together. This is not something we do on the side. This has to be about our core business practice, because our core business practice focuses on our employees, and we have to make sure that we can keep and retain them, right? This is something we have to focus on to the environment, because weather-related impacts impact our bottom line, impact our ability to do business, to even open the office, to get workers into the office, right? So that's the pivot, if you will, from where we were before, and I think that is the reason why that is promising is because it is linked, if you will, long-term, but linked to business sustainability and profit in ways that just doing the right thing people felt was not. Yes?
Professor Fairfax, thank you for your comments. I have a question, but let me set it up with an observation.
Okay.
You say that 99% of corporations believe in diversity. And of course, my cynicism kicks in. And I wonder, are they saying this to look good, or do they really mean it? You cite Disney, and we look at the more diverse films, Captain Marvel and Black Panther. But of course, Disney bought the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and they have this body of IP, intellectual property, that they can adapt into films. We don't see an Iron Woman, right? And we don't see a Black Hulk, for example. So leaving that unique example of the entertainment industry, at General Motors and Procter & Gamble and Unilever, with a more diverse board, what do products look like when you have a more diverse board? And if it's not the products we look to like we do with Disney, what do we look to see if a corporation truly includes the diverse people on its board, or if it's just to put a face on?
See, now I'm looking at my, I mean, that is the question, and I don't know that we have the answers to them. But that's what I mean by you can't just program and look away. What we're doing is we're trying different things. But I do think that companies that are truly inclusive and thinking about diversity and the right, what it looks like is them marketing products to, and marketing not in the stereotypical marketing, but truly marketing them in a particular way to particular communities, using members of those communities to help them design products and services, understand where there are gaps in products and services, and going to try to meet and fill those gaps. So I think there are things that you could take a look at to see what the company's doing. And I just want to say, corporations are not perfect. Some of them are better than others. I wasn't meaning to say that Ford was perfect, because Henry Ford is a problematic character. And I wasn't meaning to say that Disney was perfect. But everybody's trying on this journey, and I don't want to stop those who are trying. I'm happy to say you can do better and let's figure out why. But what I'm not going to do is say you're just a hypocrite because you're not doing this thing over there. I'm going to say, we did that. That's awesome. That's awesome. Let's keep it moving. Maybe shut down some of this over here, right? But it's a process, and it will go in fits and starts.
Hi, I'm Alex, joint degree JD MBA student. Again, I just wanted to thank you for all your insights at this lecture and then at the luncheon earlier. They've been super valuable. So in a similar vein, my question is, right, we've talked about like companies who are doing it wrong. We know their names. Do any examples come to mind as individual companies or, kind of resources that are looking at this thing of people who are doing it right?
That's a great question. I'm gonna try. I need to get a list. I think it is unfortunate that most of the time that's what we're focused on, the companies, and I would say the ones that are doing it right are the silent majority. In some ways, for example, there are I think the board of ELF that just comes to mind which is a makeup company, is incredibly diverse. And the makeup industry, to this point, have really tried to not just create makeup they think is good, but incorporate kind of people of color in the design and creation of makeup, and think about what women really need and incorporate that perspective. So I just highlight that because I think that's both about their board, but it's also about inclusion and the inclusion practices that emanate from their board, and that's what you're looking for to figure out what's working.
I just want to ask, how do you get corporations to be involved? Like you talked about early on about those who keep their head in the sand. What would be a good approach? I mean, sort of broad, like to educate the board about why this is so necessary for the corporation to look along these lines as opposed to how it was and not as successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think lawyers can play a very lovely role. Right, we are, especially if you're a transactional lawyer, you are their advisors, and you're telling them, right, helping them to think about risk assessments and, right, where, what are the protocols and policies, what are the best practices, what are the insights I can give around that. That's actually often what the companies are looking most to. They're telling us both about lawyers, the regulation, but also what we can and cannot do. But there is a director community. There is a corporate community. And I actually, the good news is that they are talking amongst each other. Right? There are companies that are interested in trying to continue moving forward with climate, with social, with all of the, but they're scared right now and don't know kind of where the lines are drawn with regard to legal versus illegal and don't have the crystal ball. But I do think that we need to prompt them to be more vocal. Get a plan in place, don't look crazy. Right, figure out the risk and benefits of the plan and how you're going to speak about it, and then they need to be more vocal. Otherwise, this majority of companies that seem to be at least saying the right thing will be overwhelmed by all the pushback from really a vocal minority. I wish I could take more of your questions, but my plane leaves at 7:40.
We were pushing it to the left.
Yeah, we were pushing it. But I thank you so much for the energy in the room. I will just say that the energy in the room is fantastic. I know that's about Pitt, some Steeler Nation, always ride or die, but about this wonderful person here who has kind of put this program together and given her heart and soul. She told me about her mentor and what it means. And when people have that kind of personal commitment, they're going to get the job done. So thank you for that.